The Juneau World Affairs Council presents Going Undercover in North Korea with Suki Kim. Kim is an investigative journalist who lived as a missionary and teacher in the totalitarian dictatorship. She wrote a memoir based on the experience called Without You, There Is No Us.
Hi, thank you for having me here in Juneau, Alaska. It's my first time here, so I'm honored to be here. So now I will talk about this topic of North Korea, which at the moment is making the news again with the death of murder, really assassination of Kim Jong-nam, who was the son of the last great leader. We can talk about that a little bit. But I'll tell you briefly what I did, and then we can look at some images. So I am a writer. I was born and raised in South Korea. I came to America in my teen years. And I also come from a family that's been separated by the war. So it's a topic that is personal to me, apart from a professional topic. I have gone into North Korea since 2002. I'm an American citizen. And that was my first visit for the 60th birthday of Kim Jong-il, who was the last great leader. And I have returned there repeatedly under different circumstances. I also covered the New York Philharmonic concert. I don't know if you remember that. New York Philharmonic went to Pyongyang to play in 2008, which I also went as a journalist to cover the topic for Harper's Magazine at the time. And I realized very quickly why it was so impossible to write about North Korea. So I knew that the only way to get in to write about the truth in that country would be to be embedded in it. And being embedded in North Korea would mean undercover. I had pursued that, different avenues of it. Finally, a group that I was pursuing since 2008, there was an opportunity in 2011 to go live there. Of course, the key of living there was it was only for fundamental evangelical Christians, which I'm not, and also an ESL teacher, which also I'm not. So, and that's the undercover part of what it took to live in what they call the most brutal nation in the world. And the young men that I ended up living with, not only teach, but actually live in a military compound, were the future leaders of North Korea. Let me show you this. So I ended up writing a book of investigative journalism, literary nonfiction called Without You, There Is No Us, which is the most popular song, one of, in North Korea. So I'm just going to quickly show you the video of the song so you can get a sense of this world that we're going to talk about for the next hour or so. So the song is, I guess, we'll play. Well, it's pretty clear what that world is. Two things you probably noticed looking at that what really dictates that nation is worship of the great leader. And another thing that runs that nation at the root is the hatred of the United States. And those are two things. Why I had to go undercover is because North Korea doesn't actually allow anybody in without surveillance. Generally, if you can't really get in there, and even if you go in there for a couple of days, you'll only see what they show you, and then they take you from the airport and then show you a couple of things, which all basically have to do with North Korea. I mean, great leader, nothing else. So you see the same thing even if you go 3 times, 4 times, 5 times, you will have exact same itinerary. So how can you cover that as a journalist? It's almost impossible. Another way we get information about North Korea is from defectors. I have traveled to all the regions, from Mongolia to China to Thailand to Laos, and these are countries that defectors pass. There's about hundreds of thousands of defectors in the Chinese border of North Korea, and if they make it all the way to South Korea, they pass these countries, and only about 27,000 of them have made it to South Korea. The rest of them are basically refugees stuck in China. So you can interview them, which I have done, over 100 of them in these different countries, as well as you talk to human traffickers, because also human traffickers they'll sell North Korean girls for $40 to whoever is, wanting those women. So I mean, there's just endless of these horrific stories that you can get through defectors. However, that's also one part of the story. Defectors generally come from the bottom class of North Korea. So you will get one aspect of it. Often also years after they leave or they've already fled. So what I was really trying to understand was the, inside North Korea, also inside those people who are living in it, as well as the upper class. Pyongyang, which is their capital, it's a city for selected citizens. You can't really go in there unless you have been chosen to live there. So what that means is this is the top class who are ruling that nation. So this is why it took over a decade to complete this book. I went there 5 times. What I was really shocked to discover was I had, the Western scenario about North Korea, very typical. We talk about the nuclear war. We also talk about how crazy Kim Jong-un is, or before that was Kim Jong-il. And beyond that, there's really no more information about North Korea. So then, what is really going inside the country, and who are they? And what is this figure, the great leader? The organization that I found was actually a fundamental evangelical organization. Now, religion is forbidden in North Korea, although they will show you a church and also a Buddhist temple, but with actually people in it. But, like giving a sermon and stuff, but it's like a tourist. It's kind of like, if you can imagine it, like a Disney World. Just because Cinderella is wearing like a princess dress, she's not a real princess. So it's a lot like that. So it's like a theater, really. But there is actually no freedom of religion there. It's not possible once you begin to understand that world, because there's only one person who has that power. So how was the fundamental evangelical organization? Why were they allowed? Because actually bringing proselytizing is an executionable crime. And there's a public execution in North Korea. So then how did this organization go in there is because they've been courting them and giving North Korea a lot of money. So they have been under a contract. I mean, unofficial, none of this will be on, you can't really find traces of it in paper, but the school took over $35 million to build a school, and of course a lot to operate that school. So they have cut some deal with North Korea where they will go and build this really fancy school for the sons of elite, but they will not proselytize. So this basically, and it's a fundamental group. It's not a regular Christians. It's more missionary fundamental group. And so basically the fact that they are Christians is a secret with the students. What's the deal? So which is why why I could pass, because I have never read a Bible in my life. So how did I end up among these incredibly fundamental believers? Because we weren't actually allowed to talk about any of it. We were allowed to have this, like a service in the teacher's dormitory, but that like nobody would know about that in the campus. And we all lived in a military compound. They're watching us 24/7. So when I finally found this to go in was 2011. And 2011, and I've been waiting for it for like 10 years to finally get in, to live there. And 2011 was actually year 100. So North Korea is these are just sort of basic of North Korea, is that they run the country under a different calendar system from the rest of the world. So it counts back to the birth of the original great leader. Now there have been three guys: Kim Il-sung, who was the original founder of North Korea, and Kim Jong-il, whose son, and then who died in 2011, so that's second great leader. And the third one is the current one, who is Kim Jong-un, right now 33. He got to power 5 years ago at 28, the youngest leader in the world. So these are the great leaders, 3 generations. And the first great leader, I think that it's important to sort of see the origin of North Korea, which is that, briefly, Korea is a 5,000-year-old kingdom. And then in 1945, and in 1910, it gets colonized by Japan. So of course, this is a World War I time. And then in 1945, it's liberated by the Allies. But of course, when the Allies come to liberate Korea from Japan, they didn't leave it alone. They cut the country up in half. And they gave north half to Russia, south to the United States. So beginning of the division of Korea actually begins with the colonial power cutting up a country randomly. And when you drew that line, 38th parallel, that also separated millions of families. My family was one of them. So what that means is that people thought that this border was temporary. It'll be gone next week. And that border, over 70 years later, never disappeared. It was still there. And people like my grandmother, whose first son, 17-year-old, ended up on the other side, just thought he was coming home next week. And waited. She never moved. She just waited for him to come home. Because as a mother, you're certain he's coming home. And there were millions of such mothers. So this tragedy is ultimately why I went to North Korea, because it's as if we forgot about that, because by the time North Korea attacked South Korea, that's really Russia attacking the United States. So, often we talk about Korean War and how Americans went to help Korea. Well, that's part 2 of the story, because part 1 is actually the Allies cut it up. Actually, the United States cut it up, and Russia. So this history, political decision that gets made, and it affects generations and generations and generations. And North Korea now has become the biggest gulag in the world, where none of their stories ever come out, is actually, biggest question. I think one of the biggest questions of the contemporary, politics and society. North Korea then, because Kim Il-sung, who was really handpicked by Russia to lead North Korea, it starts from his birth. So because then, that's why 2011, he's the reason for everything, the original great leader. So, and he started this philosophy. It's Juche. Entire North Korea runs on this philosophy of Juche. Juche means self-reliance, which all sounds good in our way to think about that, but all that means is control and isolationism. So Juche means we're going to do it our way. What that means is you cut the rest of the world off from you. So North Korea is a perfect example of absolute isolationist. So because then what that also means is their calendar system is going to be different. And to celebrate year 100, they shut down every university in North Korea for a year. Took out every university students and put them into construction fields, except 270 young men. 270 young men, they put them away into this school funded by foreigners, really fancy school. So if BBC were to come into North Korea for 5 days, because they invited them, then they can film that school and make it look like, well, all the students are healthy in school studying, but actually it was only 270 of them. So it's a propaganda tool. So that's where I ended up living with that year. So if everyone else is in construction fields and these young men are not, then clearly they are the creme de la creme of North Korea. Because obviously the leaders of North Korea did not want their sons in construction fields. Also, another thing about North Korea is that it's, well, both Koreas have a mandatory the military draft because it's, it's technically a war, because Korean War, which began along the 38th parallel, ended exactly where it began. It's an armistice, meaning that war never ended. And millions and millions of civilians and also soldiers' death. That war basically began where it ended where it started, without even ending. So this armistice just paused that war. So what that means is all young men in Korea have to do this military service. In Korea, South Korea, it's 21 months. In North Korea, it's 10 years. And 10 years, they don't really come home more than a couple of times. And you wouldn't really get that information except when I was living there and you start talking to them. And they're not really allowed to tell you anything. But then at some point, some of their siblings, because although they were elite, some of them, either their siblings didn't actually make it to the college exam, or some of them were not as elite, although they were, because elites don't usually go. And there's a complicated reasons why some of them might have brothers in the army. But from talking to them, it was very clear. The last time they saw them was 3 years ago, for example, because he's in the army and he's not allowed to come home. I mean, they don't say allowed, but that's pretty much the idea. The country is the size of Pennsylvania, so it's a very small size country. So to not go home for a couple of years because you're in the military draft, it's these little things, apart from, we all know there's a gulag, we all know there's a famine, but apart from that, you begin to realize the extent of mercilessness, basically. So when I was living there, in this locked compound, my job was to teach English, and the school was called Pyongyang University of Science and Technology. So their majors are computer, a lot of them, and they didn't know that internet existed. So for computer students to not know that internet exists would mean that they're not being taught anything. And that kind of knowledge it took a while to understand how they think and why they might think that way. Because when you realize it's a country where there's only one newspaper, there's some others, but it's really, you can say there are other papers, but they're not really there. It's only one really functioning newspaper, and of course that's run by the state, and it's 6 pages long. Every article is about the great leader. There's a television program. There are 3 channels, but only one works really, because that's consistent from 5:30 to 6:30. 11:30, and every program is about the great leader, nothing else. So all the books are about the great leader, and in the room, everywhere you go in North Korea, there's no blank space, because it's either great leader, like the sayings of the great leader, what he said, and but it wouldn't be anything really like it's unique. It'll be, in my that's a classroom photo there. That's me teaching. You can see the photograph of 2 leaders up on the wall, and then on the opposite wall there was actually what he said. What he said would be something like, students should study in school. Something as obvious as that. Why do we need that on the wall, which we cannot move? We also cannot move the great leader photo. So if you ever project anything, which we did, we were allowed to do it once, and we couldn't find a blank space to project anything, and you could not move those. So it is all marked. Every citizen wears a badge of the great leader. And you cannot, if you drop that and if you step on that by chance, it's like a panic. So it's almost like a god-like figure, great leader, who's everywhere, absolutely everywhere. So, in that school also, it's every classroom lessons, we had to get it approved by the North Korean staff beforehand, and every classroom was recorded. Every conversation was reported on. I ate every meals with the students, but that conversation is also reported by the students. They have a weekly meeting. Every North Korean citizen has a weekly meeting where they report on each other and present to the other. It's sort of like a layers of control where you have to present who might have said what that week that might be a little bit disloyal to the party. So everyone is watching. My room were bugged. I don't know if there was a camera, but that wouldn't have surprised me. There was a minder living in my building whose job was to watch me 24/7. So you can't really go anywhere. Also you're not allowed to go anywhere. We only had an outing on weekends, and they would be for in a school van with a minder as a group, and you go to visit, let's say, National Library for an hour. And that would be all about the great leader, because it would be like great leader built it, and then every room, it's something to do with great leader came to visit it. So no matter what, we were taken to apple farm, but it's not really apple farm. Not that I really want to see an apple farm, but every apple had a story about the great leader, because he had picked it, and his favorite apple, and that becomes, at some point, there's so much you can say about one person over and over and over again. But this is their life, that's how it's done. Because it's sort of like God, the idea is God, basically, because in some way we could say the same thing, I guess. If you go to the church, you discuss what Jesus did, and it's kind of on that model, so that you do the same thing. It's as if you read the Bible over and over and over again, it's that idea. So you discuss the life of the great leader over and over and over and over again, every television, and so that does put their psychology in a different way, because they don't think of the great leader as a president. The only holidays they celebrate are the birthdays of their great leader, and the birthdays are called the Day of the Sun, because he's the sun that rises. Kim Jong-il's birthday, that's Kim Il-sung's birthday. Kim Jong-il's birthday is Day of the Shining Star, because he's the star in the sky. And Kim Jong-un's birthday hasn't been officially reported, but the reports are, it's pretty reliable, that one. They just haven't announced it. It's going to be a day of galaxies, his birthday, because he is a galaxy. So it's a little mix of, there's all the stuff in there that's basically cult religion, also Confucianism, because Korea does have a history of, hundreds of thousands years of Confucianism at its root. That's all about ancestor worship and parent worship. So he's also like a father figure. Different father than, regular father. Father under Confucianism is also a little bit godlike. So when you add these things, it kind of starts adding up why they live the way they do. Also, it's done with this unbelievable amount of control, North Korea. So, if you can't, first of all, you need a travel pass between each town, and you can't leave the country ever. And so if you don't go anywhere, physically can't go anywhere, if there's no internet and you don't even know it exists, then you've now taken away a method of communication physically and also sharing information-wise. And now another thing you lack is also, and this surveillance system where everybody watches everyone. My students were never alone because they all have a buddy system, which at first I thought were best friends, but actually it's a surveillance system. You go everywhere with your friend, your buddy. Your room is together, you sit together, you play together, and basically you're watched. So there's a surveillance system that keeps them under control. Another thing which really has, I think, which makes this problem really a complicated problem is that education is lacking. Because if you pretend the rest of the world doesn't exist and the rest of the world is a threat, because once you know what's out there, You're not going to obey the system of the great leader. So then you can't really teach anything, because what can you teach? Literature, is that possible to talk about that without mentioning the outside world, history, science? But I mean, whatever you call, and that kind of information comes, and this is the investigation part as a journalist, is, they'll say things that makes no sense at all. They'll talk about cloning a rabbit when they're 5th grade, and did they? They'll tell you they did, but some of it is because they've been told that they have to say that, or maybe they've been told that so many times they start believing it. What that means also is that they can't tell truth and lies apart, a lot of them. That took a while for me to understand why. Because they lie instantly. And I was judging it that maybe that they are lying because, it's upsetting to hear someone lie all the time. It took a while for me to understand lies are different there. It's a survival method because you've been told to lie. Because if you don't, then you're not going to survive there. It's a mafia system. So if you're in trouble, so will your family. So right now, Kim Jong-nam died. It's pretty sure that all his, relatives will all be executed as well. That's kind of like the Stalin system of punishing someone. The same thing happened in Chang Song-taek, the current great leader's uncle, when he was executed in 2013. All the people related to him were also children, aunt, uncle, whoever, have all been executed as well. So once you have that kind of fear pressing upon you, I think that, of course, lies are a way to survive, because you really just have to survive. So there's that level. And also another thing is that they've been taught lies. That's what their education is. Entire myth of the great leader is built on lies. So if you keep, and there is actually no media in check whatsoever, because the state controls it, there's no public books or whatever you can look at to verify this information. So what that really means is it's taken away every agency from an individual to make a decision, power. So I think that when we look at North Korea and wonder why this world is possible, it is actually entirely possible if you take away everything from an individual. And in some way, the most closest thing to understand North Korea would be think of it as really an abused household, where abuse is so in every level of an abuse that there is just no way that that abused person can leave that abused home. It's very, very similar the more and more you look at it. I mean, even things like they will tell you that they read English books all the time, which of course are not allowed, but the only book they'll say that they have read, and they'll all say they've read it, is Gone with the Wind. And that's because that's about the Civil War and North winds in that book. So there's very, very specific reason why only that book they're allowed to say they have read of an English literature book. And occasionally I have heard, not from my students, but from other trips, for some reason they say Sidney Sheldon. I mean, I don't know if you're familiar. I mean, it's not high literature, so I don't know where they might have heard Sidney Sheldon. So it's sort of this random information that makes no sense. Or they'll say things like, I mean, it's just very random, and some of it is, and one thing they've all been taught, and they told me that was true, because it's in their textbook, was that kimchi, which is a Korean pickled cabbage, which most Americans find very spicy, but for South Koreans or for all of Koreans, it's a very pride, it's our national dish. And they were all told me that it was the official food of the Atlanta Olympics. And I said to them, like, that is, I love kimchi. Yes, and they'll say it's the best food in the world, and all the world is envious of kimchi. And I would say, actually, that's a bit of an exaggeration. Although I love kimchi, it's a great food, but I don't know if the whole world is envious of kimchi. Also, I don't know if it would be an Olympic national dish. So it's this kind of information that they get taught that, it's sort of, you can really make lies into a real information. North Korea is a very good example. They celebrate the Victory Day. It's 7/27, which is July 27th, and that's when they won. Their original great leader beat the imperialist Americans and South Korea and saved our nation of Korea But of course, there's an armistice, which would prove the war was not won by one place or another. It's clearly there was no winner to Korean War, but they actually have a national victory days, one of the big days in North Korea. So, and they sing all these victory songs. So, and that history has just been completely fabricated in North Korea, and that's the official information. So once you, I think, understand more and more of how this world works, then it becomes more complicated, because then the problem is actually not that simple of how much do they know, or are they brainwashed? Those are very obvious questions. Human beings are complicated, so if you've been abused, you will believe some things. It doesn't mean that they were not adorable and sweet and lovely. I fell in love with all of them. Charming, really charming. They were just these 20-year-old boys who are just absolutely lovable. And then you have this other side, which is unfathomable, where a lot of them actually felt to me a lot younger, which is what happens when you've been controlled and abused, because you get infantilized, because you can't make any decisions. So they seemed a lot younger than 20. And I think that humanity that you see when you live with them, because they are just, in many ways, not that different. They get very shy on the topic of girls, although, because they're all boys, it was an all men place that I was living in with them. And, they love to talk about girls, but they're not really allowed to, go visit them, never mind. I mean, they couldn't leave the campus ever. So I lived with them in this sort of prison state. But they are just adorable like that until you also realize there's this other control that they're under. So this North Korea problem, it's a really, I kind of cringe at looking at any news, because it's every time that reality that they live, because these older boys that I absolutely adored, that, even Kim Jong-nam news, the world is treating it as a big comedy almost. I can't believe the level of news coverage on that horrific murder, pretty much ordered by Kim Jong-un. It's a brother killing brother, and assassination using chemical weapon. It's a horrific story, but it also suggests so many things. My kids that I absolutely adored will be stuck living in that country with that horrific leader. I'm just going to show you very quickly some photos. Okay, so there was me teaching, and now that's the airport where she's holding, that's my first time in 2002, she's holding up the Son of the 21st Century, which of course means the great leader's birthday sign. That's the original great leader that you have to go bow at his statue when you arrive into his nation. That's the Kim Jong-il flowers exhibition. Those are vendor display of flowers are named after the great leader, of course. So I was taken to the Kim Jong-il exhibition, Kim Jong-il flower exhibition, where it was hundreds of these vendor displays, where I spent hours and hours and hours listening to basically the same story. So that's a Ministry of Train, like a railways display of the Kim Jong-il flowers. You see, there's another one. That building says we're happy. Every building has a slogan like that. That's all the people, I mean, it's freezing. I've been told that Alaska is cold, but I'm sorry, it's colder. And I mean, it's also colder because there's no heat and no electricity. It's just really freezing, and all the people are out on the streets dancing like that, which obviously to celebrate the great leader's birthday for like 8 hours, voluntarily, supposedly, but I mean, obviously not. That's the great leader. The Workers' Party leadership. I mean, those are not the particular individuals, but on that trip, I had to pose as a Kim Jong-il loyalist to actually go in there with a group. So I had to do karaoke with those guys, which was really a problem. I didn't know what song to sing, These are all you'll see when you Google North Korean stuff, there's always this big mass game where, they do this sort of huge mass dance. But it's really kind of cringeworthy. I mean, I've watched them a couple of times, and it would be these little kids sort of forming a sickle or a hammer that's a symbol of socialism, and it's not even socialist North Korea. It's just a pure dictatorship. And they just have to basically are just rehearsing like crazy for months and months and months. So I actually found it very cringeworthy, the whole thing. That's a Juche Tower, and that sort of mini version of that is all over North Korea. That's how the city looks. And these are my students doing the exercise, group exercise, because everything was group. They never did anything. They were not allowed to ever be on their own, so they had to do all this group stuff. That's a mountain we were taken to. North Koreans can't live anywhere, so my students had never been on that mountain, which is one of the most famous mountains in North Korea, in Korean Peninsula. And that is, every surface is with those great leader slogans, yet again. So I think that that mountain has thousands of those on every surface. So even the mountains are marked by the great leader. That's election booth, which obviously we all know there's no election in North Korea. So that's another one of those setups. That's a school with a great leaderism building where they go and study. The study of the great leader is the building of Kim Il-sung-ism study hall at the end. And that tower next to it is a Tower of Immortality, which shows the great leader lives forever. That was a typical meal, which is better than any meal that you'll get probably in North Korea. But that's a typical sort of houses that you'll see along the road. And there's a slogan of give your heart to the motherland. That's how the campus looked. And because of that walkway, you were never not visible. So everywhere you turn, you are seen. Those were my students, probably one of the last times I saw them. So it was like them taking an exam. Electricity, even in that fancy school, got cut almost every day. So the rest of North Korea is not getting electricity. We watched Harry Potter, which I had to really force somehow to make the North Korean staff approve. And it was kind of amazing to see their reaction. That was their only paper on the day that Kim Jong-il's death was announced. So I wasn't allowed to fold that paper, so I got yelled at because you don't fold great leader's image. And then I'm going to end the talk before we take questions with this video of my students that we've talked about, and it would be them singing. Without You There Is No Us was one of the songs they sang the most, and right there they're just marching to the cafeteria to eat meals. So I mean, this is how they went to eat every day. Thank you, but I'll now take questions.
So if you have questions, anything? Over here? Maybe recording? Hello? Hang on. Anyway, if you have a question, please do come up to the mic. It'll be working in a moment, I'm sure. I'll get us started. Can you think of other examples of the reverence for the great leader that was necessary, similar to not being able to fold a picture of his face? You also mentioned earlier that you have to gesture like a dove instead of pointing. Were there other things like that you could or had to not do? Or
I mean, you wouldn't be able to point it because it would be like that. You generally don't, his names, you can't really name him ever because it would be great general is a term that you used. And eternal great leader is how they would phrase the first great leader. But generally it would be like naming, actually using the names themselves would not be considered necessary. I mean, not necessary, it's just not allowed.
not so much as a sign of disrespect?
Some of that where, because he's sort of like a godlike figure, so it is just in every single thing you do, but he would be always he.
Okay, so it's not like Voldemort? Well, don't answer that. Never mind. Sorry. Next question. Thank you.
Hello, I have two questions. Number one, could you just comment on the state of food in North Korea? Because, of course, a lot of stories about North Korea are that people don't have enough food, that there have been really food shortages. And then secondly, I read a book a couple years ago about a defector, and he described the concentration camps, and the prison labor camps, where I guess the prison camps where supposedly like there could be 100 or 200,000 people, and just could you comment on that? Are there camps about how many people are in there?
These are both information that actually are easiest ones to find, not whether they're reliable or not. There are a lot of defector accounts that have come out of those gulags. So there are concentration camps. Numbers approximate about 200,000 people are in them.
About 200,000?
These are approximate because you can't verify any information. But at this point, we do have defector accounts from those gulags. Are they all reliable? I mean, that's up to questionable. But we know from UN's Human Rights Commission that it is brutality there. Same thing with the food information, because there's a World Food Program keeps up statistics on that, and there is about 80% food shortage and malnutrition.
Yes, as a journalist, it must have been really frustrating to have such a narrow view. Were you able to find information outside of the school, and how did you do that? Who did you speak with?
You can only really cover what you're seeing. But by the time I went to live there, I'd been covering it for about 10 years. So, talking to defectors does give you information on that stuff of how they live. What I really was after was just getting to know my students. Because once you start understanding, can they write essays? Can they not write essays? And why is that? And it's that kind of psychology which is actually far more fascinating. Because if they cannot really tell the difference between truth and lie, if they cannot logically think about what proofs are, because they've never had to prove anything. So then what does that mean about deeper psychology of North Korea? Because that kind of, that kind of thinking, psychologically, it's almost abused like a traumatized mind in some way. And I think that is a longer running problem, because I think that food problems and electricity problem, we can fix those if North Korea were to be a freed nation one day. But the deeper psychological damage, it's been now in existence 3 generations, 70 years. People who remember the normal life before are all dead. So what does that mean about 25 million people who are thinking in a certain way? And one of the most problem thing was really the truth and lies problem. If you can't tell truth from lies and lies from truth, what does that mean for that civilization? And that was a far bigger homework, I thought. And all of that was mostly in conversations with my students.
Yeah, first of all, thank you very much for coming. This is a wonderful talk. My question has to do more with the relationship between the Koreans on the Chinese side of the border and the Koreans in North Korea. You've explained that Koreans can't travel internationally, and there are, I forget the number, 100,000 that have left North Korea. But I also understand that Koreans on the Chinese side can go into or do go into North Korea. And I'm wondering if you can clarify what that relationship is about. Do they bring knowledge of the outside world? Are they only relating to people who are so impoverished that doesn't really make any difference? Or?
There's both of that is in a way true. I mean, I did another piece of being embedded along the border, Chinese border, where I spent, I guess I did a couple of them where I was with defectors, and then another time, more recent, I spent time with the human trafficking people. These are the people who are smuggling things in and out and making money off that. So what happens at the border is this fluid reaction of things being, because there's a sanction, But there's a lot of trade, black market trade. People who are traveling back and forth in North Korea are usually Chinese who are of Korean ethnicity, and they have family. Because it's a border, it's always like that, not sure which one belongs where. So by that border region, people are far more aware of what goes on outside because information does come. And border is better economically also because they can trade. But North Korea being North Korea, when you block like transportation, the people who are inside of North Korea that will not affect them in many ways because it's not like that information is flowing inside North Korea. That border economy is staying on its own pretty much. And it is what you imagine is smuggling, trafficking, and trafficking is generally women. And people making money off by selling items, all Chinese items, because North Korea doesn't produce anything.
No consideration to building a great wall, a beautiful wall.
I'm sure that America can give a lesson about that to North Korea at this point.
Thank you very much.
I have two questions. I read the book just before it was announced that you were coming here as part of a book group. And so we read the book, discussed it, and literally the day later, afterwards, we found that you were coming here. So it was really timely and really great. And the book is wonderful and goes into way more detail. So I have two questions. One is about the school, the university that you went to. And it was clear in the book that the people who were running the school didn't know that you were undercover. But since your book has come out, has there been any repercussion or discussion that you've had with the university? And has there been any impact on the university and their ability to go back into South Korea and continue doing the education that they're allowed to do to the extent that they're able to?
So, that whole thing of going undercover, I did come out of there with 400-page notes. And the way I did that was because I was being watched 24/7, but I could have a laptop because my cover was an ESL teacher, and I kept everything on USB sticks, which I carried on my body, like literally as a necklace. And I erased everything off the computer, and I started also the document within a document, so the book didn't really start until page 100, because the rest of it looks like school lessons. So it was really, I also kept a copy on SD card, which I also hid in a room in different spot with the light off at all time. And all that was necessary because there's just no information from within North Korea. So the school posing, or I did teach, so it's not, and I passed because it was just, that was the first year of that school, although the same equivalent existed in China, actually, that missionary school. This was the first year for this school, so it was very unorganized, which is why, in a way, I got away with what I did. School was, of course, absolutely furious, which I can understand to a degree, because when you're doing undercover work, whether you're doing, usually undercover is only necessary if the subject is so corrupt and toxic so that they will not let you. So it's like doing, if you want to do an expose of a mafia system, they're not going to give you interviews. And even if they do, it's basically a publicity for mafia, right? Like what is information should be useful for that information. I don't really want to be a PR agent for North Korean regime, which at this point media is being used as that. So that school, as a journalist, biggest concern is, sure, the outer good has to be more important, but you also don't sacrifice the people involved. Of course, school was going to be upset, but I also knew that they were collaborating with the regime. So what that means is, it's about money. So if any punishment were to come, they probably had to give a little more money. That would have been problem. And that's my guess. I don't know if that happened. The school is perfectly fine in existence. They threatened me nonstop once they knew that my book was coming out. Threatened me constantly right before the book came out and afterward. So they also wanted to censor. They wanted me to send them a book and then stop the publication. I was more terrified about the students getting into any harm. But if you read the book, so they're blurry. There were so many things that I could point out their individuality. I couldn't do that because they should not be identifiable. But on top of it, they're lawyer. So there's just really no way that you could punish them because their loyalty to the great leader is really absolute, which they were. So there are different ways of protecting like that.
So do you know if there's been any repercussions?
That I don't know. I know the school's fine. The school was really, furious with me. But school at this point is a propaganda tool and also a money draw. It's like their wallet, North Korea's wallet. So what they obviously, and I feel like if any harm had come, I would have been the first person to have found out. But so I think judging all this possible outcome, my only guess is that they probably had to pay up, and I don't know of any. And I did keep in touch with, I think I changed everyone's name, so I don't know what I called her, but she was my TA. And her, I did meet up with her afterward, once the book came out. And she was fine with it, because she was more liberal side of the fundamental group. And were they really there to bring Jesus to North Korea? I'm not really also sure. This mission model. So I could have made a focus about that. What is this school doing? Because fundamental evangelicals are funding the education of the leaders of North Korea. It makes no sense, right? What are they really doing in there? But I felt like I didn't want to go down that road. Then the focus is about them, not the students, which, right now my interest was North Korea.
And then my other question, thank you. My other question has to do with the students were about 20 years old and were clearly very naive as far as what's going on in the rest of the world. But as far as leading a country and running it, did you get the impression that at some point they were sort of let into greater knowledge of the separation and difference between North Korea and the rest of the world, or were they always kept in the dark? Or
I think the way also that's another thing that North Korea functions is that it's a very compartmentalized world. So these students were more computer majors, technology, and that's they don't choose their job, so they'll be sent to do something in that sector. So once you're in that sector, that's all you're gonna know. So they will be led into information about technology at some point, but that's all they will be allowed. So it's not like the system, and that is also what the totalitarian regimes do. By keeping, when you say control, it also works in like a spider web. You're in your little pocket and you really can't know anything else. So it's not like suddenly they'll go on internet and Google everything and start questioning and create a, big sort of rebellion project. We think that way, but that system isn't designed for that.
Hi, thank you so much. This has been really interesting. I was reading an article recently about China's response to recent missile tests in North Korea, and my understanding was that they had responded by imposing some sanctions on North Korea. And the article went into the concept that you were discussing earlier of juche, I'm not pronouncing it correctly, and it mentioned that North Korea gets 90% of its imports from China. And I was wondering if you had any insights as to that relationship and why China is basically sounds like it's propping up the regime in a large part because other countries have...
We're all prepping up the regime because, first of all, China sanctioning say they're not, it doesn't matter because all the trades that are being done at the border is all illegal anyway. So it's not like there's actually, even if a UN official goes there and checks each whatever, there's all these other smugglers who are bringing stuff in and out. So the sanctions don't mean that much. Another thing is, what are they going to do if they don't prep up the regime? Because they also don't want refugees. So there's hundreds of thousands of North Koreans at the border, and China sends them all back. Or they do this basically enslaved work of, they don't get paid at all, and it's just a horrible what goes on there. So they just don't want North Korea to fall. Neither does South Korea, where are they gonna come, the refugees? So in a way, all the international relations, when we talk about, you'll hear a term six-party talks where they all get together and talk. United States, South Korea, Japan, Russia, China, when they sit and discuss what do we do with the problem of North Korea, it's mostly to do with enabling the system so it does not fall. It's the one of the biggest tragedies in the world because we are complicit in that regime lasting, mostly because nobody wants refugees. And I think that is probably, when you think about it, the saddest state of affairs, of true violations against humanity is, I mean, in my opinion, it's the world being complicit in this regime lasting.
Thank you.
We'll take more questions, but for airtime considerations, now is the time to say thank you and applause. Thank you for being here.
That was Suki Kim in this Juneau World Affairs Council presentation, produced in collaboration with 360 North. It was recorded March 1st, 2017, at 360 in Juneau, with support from Alaska Airlines, Alaska Electric Light and Power Company, Alaska Power and Telephone, Kur Alaska Incorporated, GCI, Hecla Greens Creek Mining Company, Haight and Associates, the Prospector Hotel, Sea Alaska, and Wastman and Associates.